Now, Assange's release ends a 14-year legal saga in which he spent more than 5 years in a British high security jail and 7 years in asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And now to understand the European perspective on Julian Assange's release, we are joined now by Arthur Sullivan from DW Berlin. Hi, Arthur. How have European leaders reacted to the plea deal struck with Assange?
Well, that's the thing. There's been curiously almost no public comment from the EU or from the leaders of European countries since this plea deal was struck earlier this week. Now, in some ways, you might say that is surprising, given how prominent the story of Assange and WikiLeaks has been for various national governments, including in Europe, for well over a decade. In other ways, it's perhaps not hugely surprising, given that Assange's fiercest critics have typically been governments, obviously the US, but also some of its European allies, who've accused him of being reckless with the leaking of sensitive material. One of the few public reactions from Europe came from Germany's foreign minister, that's Annalena Baerbock. She said Assange's case had moved people, quote, all over the world and had been discussed emotionally. That's a relatively muted but nonetheless positive response. And generally, Assange's case has received more sympathy from politicians on the left in Europe. Baerbock's sentiments, of course, quite similar to those of her coalition partner here in Germany, the Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who earlier this year said he hoped the UK would protect Assange from possible extradition to the US.
Arthur, it's a 14-year legal saga for Assange, which has finally come to an end today. How supportive has the EU generally been of Assange over the years?
It certainly has been a long saga and a lot of time to assess how the EU has been dealing with this particular story. They've been typically criticised by supporters of Assange down the years for not doing enough to lobby for his case. Now, despite the fact that it was, of course, originally Swedish prosecutors who sought his arrest over sex crime allegations, which has now been dropped, that investigation, and then it was the UK, as you mentioned, where Assange was held for so long. Despite those facts and that European involvement, European leaders have often sort of referred to the case as a US one, and they don't necessarily want to get too involved in what they call US matters. However, as I said, left-wing European politicians, including members of the European Parliament, they have been vocal supporters of Assange over the years. They've brought attention to his case. And 2 years ago, 40 MEPs got together to nominate Assange for the European Parliament's Human Rights Prize, the Sakharov Prize. Now, he didn't win it. It ultimately was won by the Ukrainian President Zelensky. But the fact that he was nominated showed the level of support he had amongst left-wing politicians here in Europe. And that same year, during a French election campaign, the French left-wing politician Jean-Luc Mélenchon, he said he would offer Assange French citizenship if he were to win the election. Again, a clear sign of how European support for Assange does appear to have been very closely tied to political affiliations.
Thank you, Arthur. Arthur Sullivan joining us from DW Berlin. Now, just as Julian Assange's trial has finally been closed, another journalist's trial